Please be seated, and I welcome the children to come on up. Oh, wow. You can have a seat there or further down, whichever you like. We're staying out here. We're staying out here, and we're not messing with the cake, okay? So what if I told you guys that you are part of God? Huh? And I mean that. That's sort of where we're at today. We heard that reading at the beginning of our readings this morning from the Acts of the Apostles, and it talked about Jesus going up into heaven. And you'll notice that he does not stop being a human being. Jesus is God made one of us, and he never stops being that. So that means it's now always a part of God that there is a human being. Shh, it's okay. It's now always the truth that human beings are inseparable from God. And that's a big deal, because out in the world you'll hear a lot of people who will threaten that God might not love us anymore if we do certain things, or people who will try to scare us into thinking that God will abandon us, and that's just not the truth. One of the things we celebrate as Christians is that God has chosen human beings and will never leave us. So we don't have to be afraid of being without God. Instead, we can celebrate that God is with us, that God is one of us. And then we can focus on being present to other people, just as God is present for us. Okay, I know it's hard to sit still, so I think now is a good time for us to go get stamps. Yeah. Hello, line cutter. Back to the back of the line, mister. Butterflies. Yeah. Go. Butterflies. Hey, William. There you go. Hi, Cece. There you go. Let the last of them finish trickling out the back. This week I was in a discussion online with a lot of other pastors as we were trying to figure out how do you preach in this end of Eastertide space in which we find ourselves. What do you do with this time? And one of the pastors asserted that the end of Eastertide is sort of just like Holy Saturday, this time where Jesus is absent. You know, on Holy Saturday, it's stuck in this space. Jesus has died on Good Friday, and he hasn't risen yet, and we're sort of left without him for a space. And this pastor was asserting that these last 7 to 10 days of Easter after the ascension and before Pentecost is like that somehow we're left without God in our midst. Now, if you were listening as I was talking to the children, you know that I didn't have a whole lot of use for what that other pastor had to say. The ascension is not Jesus leaving us as if he ever could. In the incarnation, God takes on human flesh, and God never gives it up. Now that is a radical, radical thought. There are other religions in the world that give us stories about the gods coming down to play at being human for a while. If you know your Greek and Roman mythology at all, you know there's lots of stories about gods taking on human form for a little while, and then when they get bored about it, they stop being human and go back to being gods. But Christianity is the only religion that dares to proclaim that not only does God become one of us, he's not playing at it. That God chooses to be one of us, and that in the ascension, whatever that means, that Jesus takes our human flesh into the very heart of God. God isn't going to go abandoning us because God cannot. God made a choice to be forever united with us. And there is nothing we can do that would ever drive God away. That's good news. And that's the kind of good news that the world needs. Because those voices out there that try to convince us that God would leave us are pretty loud voices. There are all sorts of pastors out there and politicians and other celebrity types who would try to convince us that they have the one and only true way, and that the only way that God might ever attend to us is if we go that one and only route. Now, I'm not suggesting that we're never going to do things that disappoint God. Sin is real. We've all experienced it. And if we're honest, we know it in ourselves. But what I am saying is that our sin cannot separate us from God. Not really. So what do we do then if we don't have to earn our way back into the good graces of God? If we indeed are always in the presence of God and God is always one of us? Well, that means instead of putting all of our energy into trying to bribe God back into our lives, we can instead focus our energy on living our lives as they are, lives that are in the presence of God. If I don't have to be afraid of where God is or where God might be going, then instead I can just work on trying to love other people in that same way. What would human life be like if we were as present to one another as God promises to be present to us? If instead of making one another earn love, we simply gave it. Most of you here have at least gotten a chance to witness my little guy when he's been down for a visit, 5 years old. There's some anxiety in his life, and every time I come down here to stay for a couple of days, he worries, is Daddy coming back? But in all of his life, he has never once asked me, Daddy, do you love me? Because he knows that answer. And he knows that even when he's gotten me mad at him And he's very talented at that, by the way. He knows that Daddy still loves him. Now, somehow we have forgotten that lesson as the rest of us have grown up. I'm sure that all of us can think back to a time in our childhood where that love of mom or dad or grandparents or somebody was an absolute given. That's the presence of God. And it's what we're supposed to be for each other. It should never be a question whether I love you or you love each other or anything like that, because God loves and is present to us. That's the kind of good news that can change the world. When we remember that God is never abandoning us, then we find the strength in ourselves not to abandon one another. And then all of the pains and the sorrows and the anxieties that we encounter in the world become not insurmountable problems, but problems that we can embrace together. Sure, sometimes it's still going to be frightening, or sometimes it's going to hurt. And sure, evil will still rear its head in our lives. But when we know that we are not separable from God, when we know that we're not separable one from another, then all of those pains and sorrows, all of the fears and the anxieties are not the final word, but are simply somewhere that we need to go on the way to that new life that waits beyond. That's what these last days of Easter are all about. Getting that idea that we are not separate from God deep down into our bones, because in a couple of weeks we're going to enter into that season that the church so elegantly calls ordinary time. The days where we just have to muddle through, where the special trappings that remind us of these deep, important doctrines get set back to the side for a while. And if we don't remember that God is present always in our lives, if we do not remember that God is always living here amongst us, even in our own flesh, then those ordinary days can be hard to traverse. But if we remember the good news that we celebrate this day and these last days of Easter, that good news that God's own self is wedded to humanity for all time, then we will find the strength to walk through those ordinary days, to proclaim even with our lives the truth that we proclaim for this short time in our liturgy, that Christ is risen indeed.